So today we're joined by three of the most impactful labor leaders in the state. So let's start with some introductions. April Verrett, President SEIU 2015. April and I have been on this road together for some time now, and I can't tell you how much I've benefited from her wisdom and support. Also, it's been great to be able to share a laugh every now and then. Thank you for coming in, April. Cecily Myart-Cruz, President of United Teachers Los Angeles. Someone I'm just getting to know, but from afar, I've been in awe of the grace and power in which she's moved into her leadership and taken on some of the most challenging times faced by public education in generations. And John Grant, President UFCW 770, a longtime labor leader and warrior for justice in all quarters. I'm always honored to share space with you, sir. So thank you all for coming in. You know, sometimes it's hard to think back on those opening days of the pandemic. But for me, one of the most indelible memories is the sense of gratitude for the essential workers that really kept us moving. I remember venturing out after a few days to try to get some supplies for the family and seeing at the grocery store these workers overwhelmed, but calmly, safely making sure that everybody got what they needed. I remember teachers managing their own trauma, what must be their own trauma, managing their own family dynamics in the background, but still trying to create a nurturing and welcoming space for my kids. And hearing the stories of home healthcare workers that were doing everything they could to keep their patients safe and healthy. And I always wondered, that must have come at some cost to those workers. And so if you could tell us just a little bit about what it was like for the workers that you represented in those opening days of the pandemic. And so maybe I could start with you, April.
Absolutely. And thank you, John. And thank you, AP, for all of the amazing work that you all continue to do to move our communities toward justice and equity. I can't believe we're talking about the pandemic in those early stages of the pandemic, because often it feels like we are still in the thick of it, though I do hope that we are positioning ourselves to get to better days. But as I reflect back on the early days of the pandemic and just how much we did not know, how home care workers and nursing home workers continue to do the work that they do every single day, going into people's homes, going into skilled nursing facilities, giving care. And what we found out is that they themselves were carriers in many cases of the virus. And the tremendous weight and toll I feel that has taken on our workers is something we don't talk a lot about. They did not mean to put anyone in harm's way, but what we know now is that they just may have. And I think the emotional and mental weight of caregivers, them putting themselves in harm's way, putting the folks that they care for in harm's way, and their families in harm's way is going to be something we have to pack and deal with that trauma, not just for caregivers, but for essential workers across the gamut. We just knew so very little, and we made all of the allowances in the world for those who could stay home and shelter in place to do so safely, but we did not give enough care and attention to the people who couldn't. And so hopefully we will learn from those lessons.
That's right. And for parents of students in the classroom, we don't often get to see actually their teachers do their job. But because of Zoom technology, we're actually able to hear these teachers do their work. And I was blown away by the quality and care in which they showed up. But again, the sacrifices. What were the sacrifices for some of the folks that you represented, Cecily?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, John, for allowing me and our organization this opportunity for being here today. So congratulations to all of the winners tonight. Our educators did a yeoman's job during this horrific global pandemic. They flipped their classrooms and workspaces overnight. These same educators stepped up to the plate in significant ways. And when I reflect back on it, there's this idea floating in the ethos that educators stopped working during this pandemic. And that couldn't be more further from the truth. Since the start of this pandemic and endless stay-at-home orders, our educators stepped into action. They learned how to teach on a platform that we're using today, no one even heard of. They learned how to engage students over the internet, how to work with parents and the entire educational community to keep our babies safe, educated, and empowered at a time when despair was running rampant. I must say that parents and students also did their fair share in many significant ways. Parents learning how to become experts, IT, informational technology experts, and involved in the school day for their young scholars. And for that, as educators, we are genuinely grateful. Our students had to deal with the loss of in-person instruction. They had to deal with the loss of their interaction with their peers and friends and school support staff trying to do things in an unconventional way. Our students of color had to deal with dueling pandemics. And I want to make sure that folks actually understand that COVID-19 was wreaking havoc, but also there were calls during that time for racial and social justice. And those dueling pandemics made them more strong, made more informed citizens, and we're able to bring and manage traumas that were born out of these dueling pandemics. What this pandemic laid bare was absolutely the inequities that are faced. Many of our educators, we know they spent lots of money on green screens, printers, all of the type of things that they would have access to if they had it in their classrooms already, but had to do this and were in their kitchens or bedrooms or living rooms doing these jobs. And so, I am grateful to every single educator that did this work during and through a pandemic. And for that, we are eternally grateful.
Absolutely. I mean, we get a glimpse of the skill and professionalism that's required to educate our kids on the best of days. And in some of our worst days, we saw our teachers step up. And it killed me to hear people flippantly say, oh, well, they're not working, right? And I appreciate you lifting up this idea about the racial disparities. And one thing that I feel like we are losing sight of is that COVID-19 did not create the racial disparities. COVID-19 just flowed along the racist landscape that we already had been building here for generations, and unfortunately landed on way too many of the highest need, hardest hit communities already. And so again, what the teachers had done for all of those communities as well is something that we always have to lift up and honor. So thank you so much. And Mr. Grant, in terms of commercial food workers, again, those are probably folks that we got to see under duress, right? In terms of people going out there and just trying to get, unfortunately, it was a run on toilet paper at first, but also food and just trying to make sure they had the nourishment that their families needed. And so if you could tell us a little bit about what those openings days felt like for you and your workers.
Sure, and I too want to echo thanks to both you and the Advancement Project, because part of this is important is to bring light to all these essential workers and who've often been forgotten or looked past. And now the upside is that, in fact, they're being recognized in certain sort. And to the honorees, it was, for us especially, it was a fight between basically corporate powers trying to push disease and death onto those who work while they sit back in their C-suites, comfortably and safe. It was not, as Cuomo said, something that affected all of us. It did not affect all the classes all, and they didn't infect all sections of people. People of color in our industry as well were more adversely hit. We had packing houses. 70% of the workers in those packing houses were infected. So what especially retail and wholesale food chain workers were, both the trauma direct every day and vicariously as they watched their coworkers become infected and die. I had to make calls every other week to the family that died. And that was something that I, signed for, or even though still to this day cannot get through one of them easily. It was a medical Katrina that came to rest inside each of these stores. And there's probably I don't think there was another public gathering place other than a grocery store where people came during this period of when it all was locked down. And so fear, vulnerability, infection, disease, and death. And then as times got worse, physical assault and battery, both from, trying to get the needed supplies and the toilet paper, but even later as sort of this right-wing, became a right-wing tribal battleground about not wearing masks, not observing social distancing, doing whatever the hell they wanted, physically assaulting clerks for wearing a mask. And they work tirelessly, as you said, without breaks, 7 days a week. The companies denied them protocols. They did not even want them to wear masks because they thought that might create a panic, as if this stuff wasn't going on anyway. Refused to do testing when we had stores as high as over 30% infected, packing houses at 70%. This whole range they became medical health professionals and in fact served their community, had to protect their families. Workers would come home, enter from the back door or with the front door with a bag where they basically stripped themselves down because remember in the beginning days, we didn't know exactly how this was to be transmitted, came in and put a bag over their body, showered before they even touched or, said hello to their family, and then had to make nightly trips 2 or 3 times a week to wash their clothes. Yeah. Or some even stayed in motels just to not infect their family. And then they began to figure out, how do we solve this problem? And we had town halls of over 16,000 workers call in with the solutions, because as we know, those closest to the problem are best able to provide the solutions. And that's what the testing, the protocols, all this in large part came from workers saying, no, this is what needs to happen. Frankly, I'm so proud of the workers. They were ahead of the CDC in terms of what was necessary to protect our communities. And at this point, worker health and safety was equated to public health and safety. Yeah. Thank you all for sharing these stories. I think it's one thing to applaud the heroes. It's another thing to recognize their humanity and unfortunately the trauma that they had to carry for us, and to make sure that we don't just applaud and move on, but that we help and address some of this that's going to be unfortunately an ongoing mental health issue for all of us, but particularly those that were on the front line. So thank you again for sharing that story. But John, to something that you mentioned, just to move on to the second question, we do know that the name of the game for the opposition is about sowing division and grievance and separation. And they've gotten really good and very, very disciplined at finding and inflaming all those false choices, all those fault lines. And while they sort of move and shout and scream about masks and snake oil and voting audits, they make sure that we pay less attention to the pillaging that they're doing of our pocketbooks and our lands. And so as we've seen them play this out, even in the context of a global pandemic, even in the context when we were all so kicked down as a society, they played out this game. What do we on the left have to learn? What do we need to get more disciplined about how we show up and not just push back, but how we lead? And so maybe, April, if I can start with you on this question about what does it look like for us moving forward? How do we not just fight back, but actually lead?
Yeah, it's a great question, John, and I have lots of thoughts about this. But during the course of this conversation, I am remembering something I heard the amazing Heather McGhee say a couple of weeks ago, and if you haven't read Heather's latest book, I encourage you to, The Sum of Us. She talked about government and organized labor being the two entities that can hold power and be able to stand in the gap of what she describes as the plantation owner class, that the heirs of the plantation owner class, that those two entities together, government and unions, is what we got.
Yep.
And it is not lost on me that what the opposition has done is made us hate as a whole, both government and unions.
Yep.
And so I think one of the things we have to get better about is being relentless and holding up the truth about who we are as unions, who we represent, and that it has to be about the end and not the means. It has to be about our movement, what we are trying to do, that we're trying to end. For me, we're trying to end poverty. We're trying to build power. We're trying to give workers a venue to have real voice, to exercise freedom and agency in their own lives. And that we need government as a partner to do that, right? But let us not just think so much about building the institutions, right? Let us think about building power together so that we can really, win for people. And I just think that we can't be ashamed of who we are and what we fight for and how we fight, right? We can no longer let the opposition define who we are. We got to take the reins of defining who we are for ourselves and centering workers in that definition.
And I think as you're speaking, it reminds me as a leader of a nonprofit, I'm not in organized labor or in government, but folks that do civic work in some ways have to always make sure to check our own biases, because we may have been sold a bill of goods in terms of the narratives around organized labor and about government. And to make sure we manage that and check that and show up in solidarity is gonna have to be, I think, an ongoing question for a lot of our audience and for us ourselves as a racial justice organization, sitting in, hopefully in alignment with you in that power building. Cecily, words of wisdom in terms of how we move forward, given who we have as opposition and the landscape we have in front of us.
Well, I think what April brings up is absolutely right. But let's go a little deeper. We actually need labor and community organizations such as AP and others to work with unions. Got to work hand in hand. We've got to take the lead and fight alongside each other. We know that we're not going to always agree, but we have to be diligent and focused when it comes to leading, leaning in, and collaborating with one another. Our students expect us to be there, to call out injustice when we see it, and that is on all of us to do the same. It should be true. We also need to have greater conversations around investments. We talked about COVID, and COVID laid bare all of the inequities. We live in the 5th largest global economy in the world, but still in our Black and brown communities, we still are under enrolled. Disinvestments exist, right? We haven't said that this is what we need to do. We've got to have material conditions of our most fragile babies changed. And that means it's for our whole educational community. And all of us could have a helping hand in that. We want to make sure that our students are living up to and doing what is necessary, but the conversation has to be on greater investments that comes from the government, that comes from Sacramento, and we've got to fight together on that. We've got to have smaller class sizes for our kids. We've got to bring back arts, music, dance, drama, because in this time, and especially mental health, resources have to be leveraged for our babies. we are in a crisis moment where we have around 19,000 identified houseless families in LA Unified. Mm-hmm. I know that there are more than 19,000. What are we doing for those folks? So we have to come together around this circular motion to actually say, we believe in the power of togetherness. We believe in the power of unions, and we believe in our young scholars. And if we are actually saying that together in unison with one voice, then there is nothing that we can't do. April talks about building power. We've got to be able to build power for our workers, for our educational community. We have a voucher initiative that's on the ballot in 2022. There's an anti-union bill that is coming up in 2022. And we're going to need all of our community allies and partners to fight that and to beat that back. And know that we are going to be looking at all of us together for the sum of us so that we can actually win.
Thank you so much. You're right, 5th largest economy in the world, yet we had teachers having to buy their own green screens. 5th largest economy in the world, and we had people that were making sure we were fed having to change their clothes in the back storerooms to make sure that they didn't infect their own families. 5th largest economy in the world, and those that cared for our elderly are carrying the trauma of who they may have carried this virus to or where. And so it shows just how bare the cupboard really was in terms of the kind of investments that we need, the kind of society that we need. And I hear April loud and clear. Power building is the way to go. We got to push back on those narratives. I hear you, Cecily, that we got to do that together. And so, John, what else? What else is in the mix here? What else do we have to think about as we move forward? Because we could go with that. I appreciate that, but I'm sure there's something you want to add on top of it.
I mean, I guess there's 3 things I wanted to raise. One is all 3 of us really represent what is really the infrastructure of every community. Mm-hmm. From the time you're born, how you develop, right, to sustaining yourselves and your family, to that period of our life where we're either infirmed or, final stages, which I guess I'm in, that's part of our community, and it has to be upheld and supported, which there's this divide between work and community, that a number of rights we uphold for individuals in the community, but we don't uphold those when we're at work. The same thing, it's like when people punch a clock, all of a sudden they've given up every other right. That has to be, I think this showed that our communities are filled with teachers, home care workers, grocery clerks, meat packers, transportation drivers, and so you can't separate work from community. Secondly is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. There were movements around workplace safety that some garment workers struck. That particular factory had an unsuccessful strike, and 143 people died. That led to a movement raised by labor and the community for safer working conditions, both in terms of zoning, much less in terms of workplace. And the third is, and John, you're responsible for this as much as anyone else, is the power of a social justice movement. And you've been talking about this has to be transformative, not just a quantitative change, it has to change in quality. And there's one aspect one characteristic of our life that enables that, that's our movement. Because our movements give us the chance to change a tragedy into change. That has the potential. And for us, I think what came out of this similarly is the question of empowering workers. Our workers on their own, at the risk of being fired and some were suspended, closed the doors and refused to allow more people in to enable social distancing. They would stop work and sanitize themselves and their check stand. They would stop work if somebody wasn't wearing a mask. They would stop work if somebody was being, we had workers attacked with Nazi salutes, rammed with shopping carts, and workers stood up and said, you know what? forget it. We're not working anymore. That right of health and safety empowerment has to be given to workers. Because in fact, who else? It wasn't anybody in Cincinnati or Boise or New York City that was worried about these workers at each store. They took it upon themselves. And we have to give them the power, as we're trying to do with different measures at the county. We tried it at the state. It didn't quite go there. To, in fact, active health and safety committees empowered by workers with the right to, in fact, stop and shut down. But bring that voice that we have in the community to that voice to work.
So I go from a space of carrying gratitude for what you all and the workers you represent did for my family, for our communities. But I come out of this conversation also feeling this idea that even though the pandemic pushed us into this isolation and this question about social distancing, it made very clear, though, how tied we are together, how integrated this actually is. It's not just a teacher movement or a home care worker movement or a racial justice movement or a worker movement. These are all inextricably tied together, and we've allowed ourselves in some ways, and I'm going to speak mostly for myself at this point, to stay separated, when in the end, the big fight is not just against the opposition, but to make sure that we kind of bring ourselves together so that we can all kind of move together. And with that, I just, again, given everything that you guys have on your calendars, everything that you have on your plates, the fact that you would come out here and have this conversation with us, thank you so much for taking the time, for sharing the stories, and for pointing the way about where we really need to be moving as we think about not only this year, but the next decade, the next generation for our movement. So thank you all for making the time, and I hope to see you all in person sometime soon.
Thanks, John. If I may paraphrase the great quote, let us mourn together for all that we have lost, all those that we have lost, and fight like hell for the living.
Fight like hell. There you go. All right, thank you so much, and have a good afternoon.